Hi, I'm Don Fisher. I'd like to thank you for participating in our parent-teenager seminar titled Let's Talk. It was filmed in Danville, California, and it was our attempt at life's journey to improve the relationships between parents and their teenagers, not only from the parents' perspective, but also from the teenagers' perspective. This project, like many of our projects, comes from the people who attend our missions. If you have any suggestions for further projects, you can contact us at lifesjourney.org or call us at 1-800-548-1029. I really hope you enjoy the project, and we'll see you soon.
Now, you know, the purpose tonight, why I wanted to talk to the kids first, is I want to find out where you think you need help. You know, if somebody were to come along and fix something in your family to make your family a better family, more communication, get along better, where would you think that area would be? And that's what I ask you to do, to write it down, where you think you need help. Now, what I want to do is just give a little statement to begin with. And then I'd like to take us through the feelings of guilt, fear, and anger, and see where you are in your life right now, to see how you handle your guilts, or how you handle your fears, how you handle your angers, and where they are problems. That's what I'd like to talk about tonight. Now, I think everybody's fundamental decision in life is whether we become givers or takers. I think that's our fundamental decision. You have to make that decision about yourself. Your parents have to make it. Your teachers have to make it. I have to make it. And how we decide on that is going to determine the kind of person we become and also the kind of relationships we have. Now, when I say that a kid is a giver, I mean basically someone who treats other people the way they'd like to be treated. I remember when I changed schools in the 7th grade. I grew up in San Francisco, and I went from one side of the city to another side of the city. And it was one of the loneliest days of my life. I walked in, everybody looked at me, but nobody talked to me. I didn't know anybody in the class. And you know how important it is to be accepted. And everybody had their own groups of kids, and nobody even talked to me. And I remember one kid came just before lunchtime. He came and said, "Hey, Tom, why don't you come and play basketball with us at lunchtime?" That kid was a giver. He treated me the way he'd like to be treated. So that's what we mean when we say someone's a giver. Someone that shares the love they have inside of them with other people. When we say somebody's a taker, we mean that when push comes to shove, I'm only going to think of myself. You know, if you don't play my way, I'm not going to play. Whenever I don't get my way, I throw a tantrum. The whole world centers around me. That's what it means to be a taker. Now, how do you feel when you're around a kid who always has to have their own way? The kind of person you're always calling them, they're never calling you. Anybody, how do you feel around somebody like that? Don't you? You don't like a taker, do you? How do you feel around somebody who's kind to you, thoughtful? You like that person. And you see what's happening, my friends, for each one of you, just like for me. The more we are givers, the more we like ourselves, because we like givers. And the more we're takers, the more we don't like ourselves. And so you're developing, each one of you, in your journey to become an independent person, you're developing a relationship with yourself. And either that relationship is going to be healthy, that you like the person you're becoming, or you don't like the person you're becoming. And that's going to determine about how happy you are around yourself. And you know, the secret is, my friends, that givers marry givers and have givers for kids. Takers marry takers and have takers for kids. The more you give, you're going to get what you give. If you give a lot of love, you're going to get a lot of love. If you give a lot of anger, you're going to get a lot of anger. We give what we get, and we get what we give. And so the more you give it love, the more close friends you're going to have, and eventually the greater marriages and greater families you're going to have. Now I want to ask three questions tonight. And I'd like you just to be honest with yourselves. Now, you got to remember, we all have bad days. You know, all of us have days when we're selfish. All of us. But are you more of a giver or more of a taker? None of us are pure givers, nor I doubt any of us pure takers. But what are you more of, a giver or taker? I'm going to ask you three questions. And the answer to the questions, you're going to have a pretty good idea whether you're a giver or taker. Something I asked at the end of Mass yesterday, if you were parents, would you want to have a kid just like yourself? Do you think your parents are lucky to have you in the family? You know, as you probably know, we can't get married as priests, so I can't have kids. But when I meet a kid who's friendly, who's nice to me, who's polite, and you just know when you're around a warm person. And I said, boy, I wish the Pope would let me get married. I'd love to have a kid like that. But sometimes I meet kids, they're pretty selfish. They're all caught up in themselves. They don't care about anybody but themselves. And I said, maybe it's okay I can't get married, because I don't know how I'd handle having a kid like that. Just ask yourself, do you really add something to your family? Here's the second question. If you had to pick a best friend, would you want somebody just like yourself as a best friend? Do you think your friends are lucky to have you as a friend? I know how important friendship is for you. It's wonderful to have a friend that when they're mad at us, they're loyal. They don't talk behind our back. Or a good friend is somebody that maybe when I'm having a bad day, they kind of know it and they're there to help me. They don't make it worse. In fact, I can tell the difference between the people that are my friends and the people that use me is when I'm having a tough time, are you part of the solution or are you part of the problem? I think it's wonderful to have a friend that I call them sometimes they call me. I don't have to always be disappointed because they never call me. I remember when I was Dean of Discipline up at Jesuit High in Sacramento, I'd have parents come to me and they'd ask me, how do you think my kid is doing? I always tell the parents, look at the friends that your kid is choosing. See, you kids, you don't have many choices in your life. You don't choose your parents. You don't choose your brothers and sisters. You don't choose where you're born. You don't choose your school. You probably don't choose your teachers. The one thing you all choose are your friends. That's the one choice you have. Now, when you look at your friends, are your friends more givers or are they more takers? Among your friends, is it more important to be themselves or is it more important to be cool? With your friends, is it more important what's inside of a person or what's outside of a person? Are people more important than things or things more important than people? Now, when you look at your friends, are they mainly givers or are they takers? So when you look at that, you can see the kind of person you're choosing to become. That's the second question. Here's the third question. If you were a teacher, would you want somebody just like yourself in the classroom? Do you think your teachers are lucky to have you? I remember I used to be a teacher. I taught American literature, juniors in high school. And I loved a relaxed class. I loved it when kids would feel friendly. They wouldn't feel any pressure. They'd enjoy the class. We'd laugh. And it'd be wonderful. Because if I wanted to become a policeman, I would have become a policeman. I didn't want to become a policeman. I became a teacher. But every once in a while, I have some kid in class that was always causing disruption, always telling them to sit down, always telling them to be quiet. In fact, I was happy when some kids were sick. At least I can have a good class today. So you've got only a few more weeks of school, don't you? Isn't it just a few more weeks? When your teachers see you go, are they going to be happy or are they going to be sad? Have you made your class a better class? Because you're in it. Here's the thing, kids. If you answer those questions, you're going to find out now in your life, how's your life becoming? Are you more of a giver, more of a taker? And the more you are a giver, the more you're going to like yourself. The more you're going to see that you give yourself as a gift to other people. The more you don't like yourself, the more you're going to use other people to make up for what's missing inside of you. And so you're going to see whether your love as you get older is going to be a love of giving or is it going to be a love of taking. As I said earlier, givers marry givers and have givers for kids. Takers marry takers and have takers for kids. The best thing I can tell you is the way you treat your parents is going to be the exact same way your kids are going to treat you. Your parents ever say to you, wait till you have kids? That's what they mean. Now, what I hope this week accomplishes for each one of you is the more you get comfortable being yourself, the more you like yourself, the more you're preparing yourself for a life in which you're going to live, you're going to have a happy life, a life that's going to be meaningful for you, a successful life. And so what I hope that we can do some of the things this week between parents and tomorrow night and then parents and kids on Wednesday and Thursday to create ways that you can grow in your self-worth and self-esteem and grow in liking yourself as a teenager. Not perfectly, but it can be better than it is. So you can come out of your high school experience, your teenage years, with a really healthy self-worth. You all follow me? That's what I'd like to see accomplished. Now, I think in order to do that, and you kids are here, and I don't know how many of you here are willingly, or how many of you have been bribed to come, or how many of you want to come. But you know what I've always found in life? That when you show willingness, when you make an effort, you'll always be rewarded because things will get better. So if I can have on the part of you kids that you have a willingness, that you want to make your family a better family, and if I can find the same attitudes on the part of the parents that they want to make their family a better family, then I'm sure that good will come out of this week. There will be a good experience for you. Okay? You all follow me? That's how I see the big picture. Now, what I want to go through tonight, as I talked about in my homily yesterday, I want to talk about how you handle guilt, how you handle fear, and how you handle anger. I want to say a few things about guilt. And if any of you want to chime in and add something, I know there's a lot of pressure when there's a lot of kids here. That's an old peer pressure, afraid I'm going to say something, everybody's going to laugh. So I don't want to put a lot of pressure on you to say anything, but if you want to chime in, if you want to ask a question, if you want to share an experience, I'd really appreciate it. It'd be really nice to make this a better experience. But let me ask you this question. How often do you lie because you feel if you told the truth, the person wouldn't like you? Especially to your parents. I remember my dad, when I got into high school, my dad sat me down for a father-son chat. We were going to talk, and he said, son, he said, I know high school is, you're going to make a lot of mistakes. But he says, that's how we learn. And he says, I want you to know, son, that I can't form you like you're a little kid because you got to go out and you got to become independent. Nor can I become your friend. That'll happen later in life. But I want to help you through the high school years. I want to make it as I want to be a helper. I want to help you through these difficult times. So I want you to know, son, my door is always open. But he said to me, one thing he said, always tell me the truth. Never lie to me. Well, that sounded pretty good. Until one Friday night I tried to tell him the truth and the roof came off the house, you know. I'd been out drinking and I wanted to be honest with him. I was experimenting, I was trying, and I thought, boy, he told me to tell him the truth. Well, I told him the truth. Did I pay a price? So in other words, he wanted me to be honest, but the problem is I couldn't be honest because the price was too difficult to tell the truth. You all follow me? Now, kids, do you find that a problem in your experience? That sometimes you tell your parents what they want to hear rather than what the truth is? Is that true? That's a lot of pressure. Because I remember I didn't want to lie. I didn't want to lie to my parents. But I didn't think they could like me if I told the truth. So I remember I learned as a kid, a lot of times you tell people what they want to hear rather than the truth is. Now, why is that? Why do you think parents have such a hard time accepting the fact that we can get into messes? Anybody want to help me with that? Why do you think it is that people have a hard time? Say you make a mess. Let me give you another example. When you get into messes, are you more concerned about learning from it, growing from it, or are you more afraid of your parents' reaction? You follow me? Are you more afraid of your parents' reaction? Now why? Why is the problem? Why is it that your parents can't love you the most when you deserve it the least? You know, when you're in a mess, why is it that people have to make it harder on us? Anybody having an idea? Anybody? They want to make sure you don't do the same thing twice? So they want you to learn from it? But it doesn't seem to me that's the emphasis. The emphasis seems to be on punishing me rather than learning from it, you know?
Because they love you?
Well, could be. I mean, how about this? Does anybody here think they're perfect? I mean, haven't you all made messes? You think you're perfect? Really? Boy, I'd love to be your father or mother. I'd have no worries. I mean, none of you are perfect. Isn't that right? You all make your messes. But the thing is, why is it that I have to punish you every time you make a mess? What should be my attitude? What do you think should be, if I'm a parent and you make a mess, what should be my primary attitude towards you? What would you like it to be?
I'm going to know that you're not and dad and they realize that you weren't right.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I would tend to think, and I was dean of discipline. I was the guy that had to punish the kids when they got in trouble. And my primary attitude is when you got into a mess, it wasn't to punish you. My primary attitude was to help you grow from it. You follow me? See, there's two different things now, kids, and if you can think about your own experience. When you get into a mess, and you've made some mistakes, you made some bad decisions. Now, what do you think is healthier? Worried about your parents' reaction or figuring out how you can learn from it? Do you see those two attitudes? You follow me? See, if your primary attitude is how can I grow from it, well then you're going to learn from it. But if your primary attitude is to be afraid of my reaction, you're not going to grow from it. And how do I make you afraid of my reaction? Because every time you get into a mess, I have to punish you. See, my main function, my main purpose is not to punish you. I want you to learn from it. But if I make punishment the main thing, then I'm going to teach you to be afraid of my reaction. Do you follow me? You all follow? Now, why is it that we do that to our kids? Why do we punish you every time you get into a mess? And it's kind of a tough question. Why do you think people do this to each other? Well, why do you think, as a parent, that when you get into a mess, I feel I have to punish you? That's my primary focus, to punish you.
To make sure that you keep this food again.
Yeah, but I don't think that's going to, because you're not going to learn from it if I make you afraid of my reaction. If my emphasis is on teaching you how to learn from it, then that may happen. But when I'm there to punish you, that doesn't mean that you're not going to do it again.
Or you don't want to get punished
What you're going to do is be more sneaky. You're going to tell me what I want to hear. So you follow the question I'm posing. Why is it that we get into our heads that every time my kid gets into a mess, I got to punish him?
Because being negative is a lot easier than being positive. It's a natural reaction to get angry when something bad happens.
Okay, it's much easier to be negative. I think that's a very good point.
What did he say?
He said that the reason why it's much easier to be negative when something happens than to be positive, because our reaction is going to be anger, and we got to take the anger out on somebody. I think that's really true. That's a good answer. But you know what the reason is, at least that I'm thinking? Because what happens is we expect each other to be perfect. And so whenever somebody's not perfect, we have to punish them. And so we expect our kids to always do everything perfectly. And the first thing that comes into our head when they don't is to punish them. It comes from perfectionism. And why do parents do that? Because that's how they treat themselves. They expect themselves to be perfect, and whenever they're not perfect, they beat themselves up. So when their kids aren't perfect, they beat their kids up. Now look at the difference, my friend. Just imagine the difference now, if you can. To have a parent that when you've made a mess, you know their primary focus is going to be, how can we grow from this? How can we learn from this? How can this become a positive experience? Just think of the peace you could feel and the confidence and the trust you can have in a parent that has that attitude. Versus a parent that every time you got into a mess, your immediate reaction is to fear their reaction. So what happens is you develop on the outside to please your parent, but you ignore what's going on the inside. And that's how people learn from your family system to live on the outside, but you ignore what's going on the inside. Let me give you another example. I remember when I was Dean of Discipline, when I was in charge of punishing kids, that whenever a kid came into my office and said, "It was my fault, Father. I made a mess. I take responsibility for it." I was so happy to hear a kid say that I didn't even think about punishment. I was there, how can we grow from it? How can we learn from it? But you know, I think in the 5 years I was there, I think I could count on one hand the number of kids that came in and said, "It's my fault." It was always somebody else's fault. Now you kids are probably pretty young to understand this, or to experience this, but Richard Nixon, when he got involved with the Watergate, he was eventually impeached as president. Some of you might know that from history. But they always said about him that if he owned his mistakes and he asked for forgiveness, the people would have let it go. It would have been over with. But because he lied about it and he couldn't take responsibility for it, he eventually made a bigger mess. They say the same thing about Bill Clinton. That when he got involved sexually with the intern, if he would have come out and said, "I have a problem, I need help, I've got to deal with it," people would have been very forgiving. But because he lied about it, he made the bad situation much worse. And you know, the amazing phenomenon, kids, is that they keep saying that about if you tell the truth and own up to it and take responsibility for it, things are going to be much better. It's going to work out a lot better for you. But when you lie about it, you're always going to make it worse. Now, what I think the problem is, why people can't do that, is it's not easy to admit you're wrong. Because let me ask you this, and it's kind of one of the areas that I really like to work on in our family systems, is if you can own up to your responsibility in doing something, if it's okay in your family to make a mess, because you know, my friend, that's how we learn things. If I didn't make a lot of messes in my life, I wouldn't have anything to talk about when I preach from the pulpit. You know, I've learned the vast majority of things I've learned is from my messes. And if we don't mess up, we're never going to learn. Now, what I'd love to see is where people can own their own weaknesses, their own brokenness, can own it, and people can help each other to grow from it instead of being obsessed about it. you follow what I'm saying? Now, wouldn't it be wonderful, and it's really possible in a family, to be able to say, I have my faults, I have my weaknesses, I made a mess. Mom and Dad, can you help me learn from it? Can you help me grow from it? I think that, wouldn't that be a lot easier to handle life that way? Wouldn't be that lot more positive? But you know, my friends, that's what the gospel is all about. Is that that's what God's unconditional love is all about. God loves us without any conditions, and He asks us to love each other without any conditions. What bothers you the most that an adult can do to you? What gets you angriest about your parents? What thing that they do makes you angriest? Okay. Embarrass you in front of your friends? Okay. He doesn't pay any attention to your boundaries? Hypocritical? Okay. That's a big one, isn't it? They get angry at you taking drugs, but then they could drink too much, you know? They nag. Oh, I hate that nagging. They still do. Okay, now yes?
When they keep telling you to do something over and over and over.
Nagging.
Even if you're doing it.
Well, you know what we do? Let me tell you something, kids. When somebody tries to control you, isn't it your natural action to want to do the opposite? That's what mine is. If you nag me enough, I'm going to go out and do the opposite. That's my natural reaction. Yeah, yeah. Yes?
When your parents think they're right with everything and they're not.
How about this one? Is this what you're saying, kind of in a way? And I don't want to I want you to see if this is true, kids. Because I know this is true for me. The thing that used to anger me the most with my parents is when they didn't listen. When they didn't listen to what I had to say. They made their judgments without listening. Is that what you kind of mean? How about that, kids? Yes, sir? They try to change who you are. They're going to mold you to be the way they want you to be. But isn't that in some ways when I'm saying they're not listening to you as a person, they're trying to make you the person they want to be? Isn't that the same thing, kind of? Now, let me say something, kids, about anger. Now, I don't know how much anger is in your family now. But some of you, I'm sure that there's some of you that you can't talk to your parents without getting angry. Or maybe one of your parents without getting angry. Okay? Some of you know what I'm talking about? Now, kids, this is the thing about anger. That if you keep that anger inside of you, it stays there until you find a way to get rid of it. And you know what's going to happen, kids? If you develop a lot of anger, and you keep a lot of anger inside of you, you're going to carry that anger to all your relationships. You know what I used to tell people on their wedding day? Some of you older kids may understand. I used to tell them, you're not marrying each other, you're marrying each other's mother and father. So what happens oftentimes when people get married, they bring the anger that they had from their childhood. Each one of them brings them into the marriage, and that's where the anger comes from. You know, as long as you keep that anger inside and you don't release it, it's always going to stay there. And you're going to bring it to all your relationships. Now, wouldn't it be a wonderful thing if in your relationships you could find a way to make anger positive? To make when it's, like for example, negative forms of getting angry are whenever you rage, or you go slam the door and go into your room. You're always making a bad situation worse. And what happens is, over your teenage years, the anger just accumulates. And so it's just like if you have a barrel, you're putting more and more anger into it. Now, wouldn't it be a good thing if you found a way in your family that it's okay to get angry? It's human to get angry. Jesus got angry. We all get angry. But what you do with anger is good or bad. Wouldn't it be a wonderful thing, kids, if at your age you could learn how to make anger positive? Wouldn't that be a marvelous thing where you could grow from it and learn from it, and you could bring that to all your relationships? So you don't have to be afraid of anger? Because I'm sure you can see how destructive anger is. I'm sure some of you, I know with some of the kids, they tell me that the thing that bothers them so much is the anger they get with their moms and dads, you know, when they fight. I'm sure some of you have come from divorced families, single parents that you have. You can see the destruction of anger, how it can build up in a marriage, and how they can always be arguing about the same things. They're never resolved. That's really unhealthy, kids. And if you can learn in your family system that you don't have to be afraid of anger, but you can make it positive, wouldn't that be something that's very positive? Give me your response on that one. Does that make sense to you? See, what I'd like to do, and our time is up, is what I'd like to do, my friends, is over the next Wednesday and Thursday nights, I'll talk to the parents tomorrow night, but Wednesday and Thursday nights is talk about how we deal with, in a positive way, where we become human and how we deal with our messes in a positive way. Instead of we grow up learning from things, instead of being afraid of our parents' reaction. That in our fears, we learn to talk through them and share them and work through them instead of letting them own us. You see, if they're your secret, if your fears are your secret, you give them a lot of power over your life. And they're going to run your life, your fears. And you can see how, maybe you look at your parents and you can see adults, how much fear can run people's lives. And the third thing, if you can learn how to deal with anger and make it something very positive that you don't have to be afraid of, and something that doesn't accumulate in your family, but something you grow from, I think that's what the goal is for these 4 nights. So that's just what I wanted to set up tonight. Does that make sense to you, kids? That's what I present as a possibility of this program to help you. Are there any questions? Well, I want to thank you, kids. You've listened very well tonight, and I really appreciate it, and you've participated. And I hope for all of you this is going to be a positive experience. This is Danville. This is the second night of the talk. What I'd like to do is just be able to get the data so that Wednesday and Thursday, by listening to both the kids and the parents, we can give positive solutions to some of the difficulties. How to deal with, and I'm going to do as I did last night with the kids, take guilt, fears, and angers. But before I begin that tonight, I'd like to do the same thing I did with the kids last night. I think our fundamental choice in life is whether we're givers or takers. You know, I think that whether that's your decision you have to make, that's a decision that I have to make, it's a decision your kids have to make, and nobody can ever make that for us. And that we're never going to be perfect givers, you know, or perfect takers. It's what are we more of? Now, I'm going to ask you some questions, and I just want you to be honest with yourself, so where you are in your life right now. Here's the first question. If you were your spouse, would you want to be married to a person just like yourself? Do you think your spouse is lucky to be married to you? You know, and I think it's wonderful. It's wonderful when you have a spouse that's honest. You know the important thing about communication is if I don't know you're telling me the truth, and that's a lot of problems with the kids. If I don't know you're telling me the truth, we lose our relationship. I have to trust your words. So am I the kind of person that's honest with my spouse? Am I thoughtful? You know the idea of what's a giver. A giver is a person that treats other people the way they'd like to be treated. So in your relationship with your spouse, do you treat your spouse the way you'd like to be treated if you were your spouse? You know? Do you treat them like they're special? Okay? If you were a parent, if you were a kid, would you want to have a parent just like yourself? I asked that Sunday at Mass. Are your kids lucky to have you as a parent? You know. How about this one? If you were to pick a best friend, would you want somebody just like yourself for a best friend? Do you think your friends are lucky to have you as a friend? You know? It's wonderful to have a great friend. You know, when they're mad, they're loyal. They don't talk behind my back. You know, that when things are tough, you know, I can always tell the difference between people that love me and people that use me. If I'm having a bad day, are you part of the problem or you become part of the solution? Are you there to lift me up or are you there to beat me up? You know. Do you think your kids are really lucky to have you? Well, are you the kind of parent that you'd like to have? Are you the kind of friend that you'd like to have? How about this one? I think, you know, I told this to the kids last night. I remember when I was Dean of Discipline, and parents had come to me and they'd asked me, how do you think my kid is doing? And you know what I'd always tell the parents? Look at the friends that your kids are choosing, because that's the person they're becoming. See, the kids don't have many choices in their life. They don't choose their parents, they don't choose their kids, their brothers and sisters, they don't choose where they're born, they don't choose their school, they probably don't choose their teachers. The one thing the kids choose are their friends. And that's the person they're becoming. And I think that's true with couples. If you want to know the kind of couple you're becoming, what kind of friends do you choose as a couple? It's very, very interesting. Are your friends givers or are they takers? Among your friends, are people more important than things or things more important than people? Among your friends, is what's inside of a person more important than what's outside, or is the appearance world everything that counts, you know? It's amazing. When I was in the parish in Phoenix, it was a wealthy parish, and what they did is they had to have a rule in the grade school, the 7th and 8th grade, that they had to cut their labels off for their clothing because it became a fashion show to see who could wear the most expensive blouses. Well, they cut off the labels, and you know what I noticed so often with the kids? A lot of the kids who had to wear these expensive clothes, because that's who said who they were, 20, 30 years later, their parents, the big deal was being in the country club, you know? That oftentimes the kids reflected the parents, their values. Are your friends heart people or are they superficial people? So if you see the kind of friends you're choosing, you're going to get a pretty good idea of whether you're a couple that gives or takes. And I presume most of you are givers, because you wouldn't be here tonight if you weren't. You know the beautiful thing? Givers marry givers and have givers for kids. Takers marry takers and have takers for kids. What I told the kids last night is the way you treat your parents is going to be the exact same way your kids are going to treat you. You ought to see their eyes get really big. Do you ever tell your kids, wait until you have kids? That's what you mean. So what the thing is now, and I really do believe it, my friends, if I can say this tonight, when I meet a really good kid, a kid that's warm and friendly and thoughtful and kind, it's usually because he has loving parents. You know, the kids reveal, they learn an awful lot about who they are and what they do from their parents. You know, I don't like to name drop very much. In fact, I'm going to drop a name though, Tom Brady. Some of you know him. He won the quarterback for the Super Bowl. He's everything they say he is. He's a wonderful kid. I know he's known his family for years. He's very honest. He's very real. You know, he doesn't have a big head. Very kind kid. And you know what? He comes from very loving parents. So the best thing you can do, the best guarantee you're going to have to turn out to have good kids is to be giving people yourself, towards each other as spouses, towards your kids and to everybody else. Because, you know, the old thing Jesus said a long time ago, the way you measure it out is the way it's going to be measured back to you. What you give is what you get. In fact, sometimes people come to me and their lives are just filled with turmoil. And they say, Father, why do I have so much turmoil in my life? You know what I tell them? You give a lot of turmoil. You give what you get. So just remember that as we're talking, and that's what I hope tonight, the process tonight, the process the next 2 nights, is a process where we all enter into giving, being thoughtful, treating other people the way we'd like to be treated. And the more we do that, the more we get it back. The more your kids treat you that way, the more they're going to get it back from you. The more you give it to your kids, the more they're going to give it back to you. The more your kids give it to you, you're going to give it back to them. You give what you get. Okay? That's kind of my little introduction. Now, what I want to take tonight, as I mentioned on Sunday, I want to take guilt first. The whole experience of being guilty, because that's what we deal with when we talk about punishment or when kids get into trouble. We deal with human guilt. Now, let me ask you this question, because I think, you know, the amazing thing is how many parents forget their own adolescent years when they become parents. In fact, the craziest thing is the wildest of parents usually become the strictest of parents. It's amazing how that happens. Now, do you remember when you were a kid? If you can remember back to when you were a kid and you got into some of your messes, were you more afraid of your parents' reaction? Or were you more concerned about learning from it and growing from it? Even today, if your parents are alive today, can you be yourself with your parents, or are you still trying to be the person they want you to be? Okay? Do you follow the question I'm asking you? Now, you can even take this in your marriages. When you get into a mess, when you've made a mess, where is your consciousness? Are you more concerned about growing from it, learning from it, or are you more afraid of the other person's reaction? You all follow that question? Now, there is something really wrong with why when we get into a mess, or I get into my mess, my main focus is your reaction rather than me growing from it. Because it's my life and I've got to do something with it, but I become more afraid of how you're going to react than I do about the truth of things, you know? How many of you, and I think it's, I can remember I did it as a little kid and I still can do it sometimes. I can lie. And most of the lies I tell are not lies that I want to tell. I don't like to lie. But a lot of times I will lie because I'm afraid if I tell you the truth, I'm going to have to pay a price. You know? Do your kids tell you the truth? See, a lot of times we make the issue, why didn't you tell me the truth? Why did you lie to me? That's not the real issue. The real issue is the price they have to pay for the truth. That's the issue. Okay, do you all follow me? Now, there is a gigantic problem, and I think it's something that we have to really look at, and I'll talk about it when we get the kids and parents together. And I think it came from a lot of the ways I talked about this 2 years ago, and I go through it in the book and in the tape. The way we were taught about God. See, I think that darn perfectionism, I think it's a terrible slavery. That we think that we have to be perfect. And you see, if I think I have to be perfect, and whenever I'm not perfect, I beat myself up, then I'm going to pass that on to my kids. So whenever they're not perfect, my immediate reaction is, I have to punish them. That's my immediate reaction. Because they're not perfect. Now, I just want you to think that now. I want you to think when your kids get into trouble, when they make a mess, what is your procedure in operating? How do you handle their mess? Let me ask you two questions. First of all, do you take it personally? You know what personally is? Give them the silent treatment. The icy silence, the strained voice. How could you do this to me after all I've done for you? My dad could just give me that one look. See, that's the key thing, my friend. Do you take it personally that your kid chose to do it to you? And that's crucial, because that's what we call conditional love. Now, if I can explain this in a way, you know, what we do is we expect them to be perfect. And when they're not perfect, we take it personally. So what do we want? Perfect kids. Good luck. See, that's the problem. And so what happens is, because we don't accept that we have kids that are human beings, but we want them to be perfect, we create kids that eventually are going to lie to us to tell us, so they want us to like them, and they're afraid if they tell us the truth, we're not going to like them. See, when you take it personally, what happens is you take away love, and you're telling them when they do this, they're not lovable. Do you follow what I'm saying? I mean, let me show you how gigantic this problem is. You remember Richard Nixon? Some of you are old enough to remember how, when he got in trouble in Watergate. And the problem was that if he would have been honest about it, and he would have said, I'm sorry, I did get involved, I had these people that were a little like loose cannons, and they did something I didn't approve of, but I'm sorry for it, I apologize to the country, he would have never been impeached, or he never would have had to resign. And we always hear that, you know, if you can admit you did it wrong and take responsibility, it's a lot less than if you lie about it. Look at Clinton. If he would have said in the beginning, I have a sex addiction problem that I've been struggling with all my life, it's very difficult having it as a president, I want to pray for me, I'm going to try to get it fixed, I've got real problems, and I'd like your prayers and compassion, I think the country would have dealt with him much differently. But he lied about it. Now the crazy part of it is, my friends, we hear this all the time. You talk about public figures. Tell the truth, and the worst thing is the cover-up, right? We always hear it, and yet people do it every time they cover up. Even though they know that the best policy is to be honest. And I think that's true with our kids too. Remember we say honesty is the best policy? Well, it isn't the best policy because it's the worst policy, you know? Now, I don't want to do a talk. I want you to participate with me. Are you following what I'm saying? Anybody have any comments on it? Any experiences? Anything they want to share? I want you to feel free of doing this today.
Well, the thing you said about Clinton, he wouldn't have been able to be that honest because he's in denial about who he is. So in order to be honest, you have to be honest with yourself first. And
yeah, but I think what happens, though, is how do people develop denial systems? Because they can't be honest. And it starts, and you know, one lie, you've got to tell a million lies to cover it up. So I can't really, I remember, I think I told the story when I was here. I remember my dad telling me this when I went to high school. He sat me down for that father-son chat, and he said, son, I know you're going to make a lot of mistakes in high school. And he said a brilliant thing. I've discovered after he said, I can't mold you like a little kid, nor can I be your friend. I think people make a lot of big mistakes about being their friend. You know, you can't be your kid's friend. If you're going to be your kid's friend, you've established them as king and queen of the house. You could be friendly. But he says that's going to come later in life. And it did. It came later in life. I became his friend when I got my act together. But he says, I want to help you through your difficult years of teenage years. And he said, son, my door is always open. But he said one thing, he said, don't ever tell me a lie. Always tell me the truth. I remember one time I was out drinking. I told my dad, well, Dad, I drank too much. The roof came off the house, you know. Well, I learned my lesson. You better not tell the truth. You better tell him what he wants to hear, you know. And so what happens is, this is where trust breaks down. I can, you know, if I'm going to trust you, I've got to be able to trust you with my weaknesses. And I'll tell you something, my friends. This is when it starts, when little kids decide whether they can ever trust their parents or not. See, that's why there's so many adults. I know so many adults that are in their 40s that can open up to their friends, but they're still afraid of their parents' reaction. Yes?
But does telling the truth alleviate punishment?
No, we'll talk about that.
I think that's where it gets tricky, because my daughter will say, well, if I tell you the truth, are you going to get
you have to promise you won't get mad, and that's kind of the.
Well, that's what I want to, what the problem, that's what we're going to talk about the next 2 nights. How do you deal with the human situation? I think there's a whole different perspective, though, if my primary attitude is to punish you or to help you grow from it. Those are 2 different sets of thinking. But what I want you to know, my friends, and this is how we've got screwed up spiritually, this is part of the Ministry of Life's Journey, what Don and I have tried to do in our book, is this whole idea of getting caught up in this perfectionism where we expect each other to be perfect. I mean, look at what you do in your marriages. And I just would say that possibility that you take each other personally. Say, for example, your husband comes home late. Maybe he got busy working too hard, or he got busy out playing golf with the guys and he came home late. And he didn't call you to let you know when dinner got cold. You know, right away the reaction is to take it personally. Like he sat there and told his friends, you know what I'm going to do tonight? I'm just going to sit here and talk to you, and I'm going to let the food get cold, you know? That's what we do when we take it personally. You know, like they decided to do it to me, you know? And you know where I think the fundamental problem comes, my friends, and this is what I want to talk about guilt, is we have to become comfortable, if we're going to ever do it for our kids, being human beings. You know, realizing that we all have bad days. See, that's a problem, and I think it's, when we talk about punishment and stuff, we talk about it, is helping kids form their conscience. I remember when I was Dean of Discipline, that was one of the hardest things I worked with kids, is so many kids didn't have any conscience. You know, if it felt good to me, that's what made it good, you know? If I feel like doing it, that's what makes it good. If I don't feel like that, but kids, helping them form conscience, a sense of right and wrong. But I think what happens is, if you're expected to be perfect, and every time you're not perfect, you're punished, then you don't develop a sense of right and wrong. What you do is you learn to lie about yourself. You develop all kinds of denials because you can't be real. Now, I just like with all of us, I mean, when Don and I wrote our book, we wouldn't have written that book unless we made a lot of mistakes. We wouldn't have anything to talk about, you know? That's where you learn in life. In fact, I find, you know, with kids that haven't had any problems, you know, kids that, for example, every time the kid cries, they get a teddy bear, or every time there's a problem, we've got to take the pain away. The kids are very shallow kids. Until they go through some experiences of struggle where they have to go into their depth and find out some inner strength, and then they develop something from inside. Then they become deeper people, you know? I even had kids here the other night, some parents brought in that were very young kids, but they've been through a very bloody divorce, and because of that, they've developed, even as young kids, they've developed a lot more seriousness about life than a normal kid, you know? But I think this whole idea of how we handle guilt. How comfortable are you not being perfect? How comfortable are you having a bad day? Because all of us have bad days. How easy is it for you to say you're wrong or you don't know? How comfortable are you with your humanity? And I think something, my friends, I think this is where the gospel comes in so much and there's a centerpiece, is God loves us just the way we are. You know, God does not love perfect people because they don't exist. God loves us the most when we need it, God loves us the most when we need it the most, and when we deserve it the least. So I really ask you, as a question to begin tonight, in dealing with human weakness, with humanness, are you comfortable being yourself as a human being, and you don't have to be perfect? Remember I mentioned that thing Sunday, I think is so telling. Can you be comfortable when what you do is a 7, and it's only a 7, it's not your best you can do, but it's the best you can do right now? Do you beat yourself up when you're doing the best, even though your best is not what you're performing, but it's the best you can do right now? Can you be comfortable with that? I had a lot of kids in the letters they wrote yesterday is pressure about grades. You know, it's the kind of thing that we grew up. I don't know if any of you people have that same problem. You know, if I come home with 5 A's and 1 B, why didn't I get all A's? You know, always looking at that silent praise stuff. I don't know if you silent praise your kids. Silent praise is when you do it right, I don't say a word, but I'll sure let you know when you do it wrong. And just because I'm not saying anything, know that I'm praising you. You know, that is, I mean, we pass that. See, what I want to tell you, kids, I want to tell you, I'll be right with you, Don. What I want to tell you this is the way you look at yourself is what you're going to pass on to your kids. If you expect yourself to be perfect, then you're going to expect your kids to be perfect. If you beat yourself up whenever you're not perfect, you're going to end up beating your kids up whenever they're not perfect. I just want to take this first area of guilt. You follow what I'm talking about, my friends? I think as we talk about a positive form of punishment, I think what has to happen is it's got to be positive in your own life and how you treat yourself. Because that's how you're going to mirror it with your kids. If you have a methodology in your life that when you make a mess, you know, I'll just share with you just very briefly my 3-step process that I've learned through my faith in the good news. Is whenever I make a mess, my first thing is to acknowledge that I made a mess. That it's my fault. It's my problem. I did it. Because you see, if I can't own it, I can't forgive myself. If I can't own it, I got to blame somebody else. And I'll remember when I was dean of discipline, I'll tell you, it was unbelievable how few kids in the 5 years I was there actually ever came in and said, "Father, it was my fault." It was never their fault. It was always somebody else's fault, you know? And it was so wonderful if I could meet a kid who could take responsibility for it. And a lot of that comes from a family when kids, it's okay to make a mess. Because that's part of the human condition. That's part of being human. And so they can take it. So what I do today is I sweep my side of the street. I do I take my responsibility for my wrong. And then the second step is I forgive myself as God forgives me. I don't bury the guilt. I give it to God. And my third step is I ask God to teach me how to learn from it. What can I grow from it? So I go through a 3-step process today, how I deal with my own human weakness. First of all, I have to acknowledge it's my fault. I did it. The second thing, I forgive myself as God forgives me. And the third thing that I do is I ask God to teach me to grow from it. And that becomes a model of how I work with other people when they get into messages. Do you follow what I'm saying? So what I really ask you tonight, and you might give some real thought to it, because I think this is where the gospel really comes in. Do we really believe the gospel or not? Do we believe that God loves us just the way we are? Or do we have to be perfect for God to love us, you know? Do you think you're lovable just the way you are? You know, warts and all. Okay, that's the first thing. Let me take fears. What are some of the biggest fears you have? I'd like to get more participation. Anybody like to? What do you see as your biggest fear as a parent of teenagers? Yes?
Getting sick, something happening to me.
You getting sick. So you can't take care of them. I always say, you know, for me, my greatest fear of dying is not meeting God and being judged, but how will the world ever last without me? That kind of a fear, you mean?
Exactly.
Huh? Fear of failure. Failure as a parent? Being a failure as a parent. Okay? Some other fears.
Fear of getting old and not having children around you to be there for you.
Yeah, that's... You know what I see happen so often today is it seems the kids, when they go through their 20s or 30s, they got to blame their parents for their problems. There's a lot of that today. And then they get sick and tired of it, and then they start taking responsibility, and then you just got to go through that period with them. Yeah, yeah. I don't know. You know, I have this thing that I think the best time to have kids, it's not when they're infants. It's not when they're little children. Certainly isn't when they're teenagers. But you got to let them go. Kids got in their 20s and 30s, and today adolescence can last a long time. They got to go out there, and the 20s and 30s is a very violent time in a person's life, because a person's discovering their own truths, you know. It's tough. I mean, just look at your own experience, what it means to be a husband and father, or mother or wife, balancing everything. You know, it's very, very painful time. And then I think when you get started, sometimes it takes to your 40s. I know it took me to my 40s to start putting my life together. And you start discovering your truths, and then they come home, and then they come home as adults. And then that's the time when you can become friends. That's the best time to have kids, is when your kids have become adults. They become their own persons. And that's the greatest time to have family. At least it's been my experience. But you got to let them go in those years, you know. So a lot of those fears can take over, you know, in fact, you know what I think? I mentioned this when I gave the mission. I think the greatest gift the kids are to their parents is they lead their parents to God. You're either going to have to let go of them or go crazy. In fact, I really do. I think that's where a lot of parents finally develop a spirituality and learning to let go of their kids. And I think in this day and age it's going to be doubly so, because things have changed so much. They're moving so fast. Any other fears that you want to talk about?
I have a fear of something tragic happening to my children, and then me taking the blame of it.
It was your fault somewhere.
And it being my fault. Because I didn't raise them the best I could, or I didn't teach. I feel like it's my responsibility to teach them to look to God and Jesus first. And what if I...
When they start not going to church and all that kind of stuff?
Well, not just church, but it doesn't necessarily have to be them not going to church. Just them not going to them within themselves.
Not having a spiritual journey.
Right.
Yeah.
And something tragic happening, and then me thinking it's my fault.
You weren't the perfect parent.
Right.
Yeah. Any other big fears with your kids? Yes.
Growing apart from them when they get, mine are small right now, but when they get to be teenagers, like they're, you know, being heart-wrenching, they turn on you, or they just don't want to hang out with you.
They don't want to have time with you, yeah. You know what I found is very interesting? You know about passive-aggressive. I've done a lot of work in retirement centers. And you know, a lot of times, if parents don't have time for their kids when they're young, and they give their kids a lot of things instead of quality time and presence, then when the parents get older, they've created selfish kids who don't have time for their parents, you know? You know, that whole idea, what goes around comes around, you know? Yes?
I just want to point out that everybody who said that a fear in here was a woman. Everyone that just said who has a fear.
There has been one man.
And let me say one other thing. I think men, for the most part, men don't want to be afraid. You know what men like? They like anger. Because we don't want to be vulnerable, we don't want to be afraid, but I do want to control if I'm angry. So I think anger is fear announced. When you find you've got a lot of anger in your world, you're probably afraid, but you don't like that, so you go to, I'm in control because I'm angry. And that's, so just look at that.
Okay, yes, sir. We got a man.
I think one of my biggest fears is at some point is just letting go. My kids are young still, and I know at some point, probably at the teenage years, I will have to let them go and let them make their own decisions. Hopefully, they will be good decisions. And kind of losing that control that we have when they're younger.
Losing the control you had when you were younger, yeah.
Just fear of letting them go.
Yeah. I mean, how many people down deep have this feeling that we have to be in control? It's pretty basic, isn't it? And you know, that's the illusion in the world, is that we're in control. I remember, you know, this happened to me. Since I've been here, I tore my Achilles heel last summer hiking in the Sierras. And I still had 10 more miles to hike. I wish I had grandkids to tell that story too. But you know what happened? It's an amazing phenomenon for me. You know what's amazing for me? Because normally, if I was a typical Jesuit, and that had happened, they'd send somebody to replace me. I teach at a high school parish, and I go away to recover in a nice spot, you know. But I have people that are dependent on my income. So I had to go back to work. And I'll never forget, it was, I had the surgery a week after September 11th. And 2 weeks later, a week after the surgery, I had to go back on the road. And I was 5 weeks on the road, I'll never forget. And my brother-in-law took me to the airport. And you had to get there 2.5 hours early, you know, at that time. Well, nobody told me because I was in a wheelchair, I'd get right through. So they parked me with 2.5 hours of waiting. And I had to go to the bathroom, and the bathroom was way down the hallway, and I just learned how to crutches, and I had my briefcase, and I was pretty klutzy with the crutches. I never wore crutches before. And they forgot to come and get me. And I sat there, and everybody's getting on the plane, and I yell and scream, and they finally came and got me. But what happened was that eventually I was the last person on the plane. The first parish I go to, my room was on the 3rd floor. 3 flights of stairs. Have you ever tried to go up? And I couldn't put any pressure on my foot at all. Have you ever tried to go up the stairs on crutches? I ended up going up on my behind. But what happened is I came down the first time, and the banister broke in my arm, and I went flying. The second parish I went to had throw rugs. Do you know why they call them throw rugs? Because they throw you. If you put a crutch on a throw rug, it'll throw you. The next parish I went to, and it was up in Vancouver, BC, and I had to go to the church, and it was rainy, and my crutches slipped, and I fell on my head. I'll tell you, it was an experience. But you know something, my friends? I tell you, what I learned, 2 things from that lesson. First of all, I learned I wasn't in control. And I'll tell you, that's a valuable lesson for anybody to learn, that we're not in control. And you know what I had to do? For the first time in my life, I had to let people help me. You know, they had to bring me water. They had to empty the bedpan. They had to bring me my food. I had to depend on people for my basic needs. And you know something? I gave people a chance to love me. You know? I was vulnerable. And it was a wonderful experience, you know? It really was. I got to know priests better than I ever get to know them because they had to bring me my food, you know? I gave people a chance to love me. But you see, the problem is I've suffered for that thing. I have to be in control. If I'm not in control, that's when Don talks about, that's when I can get angry. So I want you to know, because this is, I think a lot of times the reasons why parents keep their kids so filled with activities is they want to keep them out of trouble. You know? I think that's a lot of reasons for people. And so they're really motivated by fear. Now, let me ask you this, though. And that's what fear makes us do, control. When somebody tries to control you, what's your natural reaction? Don't you want to do the opposite? Isn't that your natural reaction? So when I feel controlled, even if it's a bad thing, I want to do it because I hate to be controlled. So I want you to see the dynamics of how much fear runs your relationship with your kids. And as Don said, the fear is what sets up the anger when they don't fulfill your expectations. You know. But how much fear is in your attitude towards your kids? I think there's a lot of fear about kids today. I think that thing I mentioned on Sunday, you know, because I really do think, I think a kid should just have one activity at a time. That's my belief. I always say the great principle you can use to see how, whether activities have become more important in the family, is does it get in the way of the family meal? I think that's a criterion. Now there's always exceptions, but is the family meal the exception or the rule, you know? Because, you know, it's amazing, and they've done studies, the kids do much better in studies when they have a family meal. They're much more likely to stay away from drugs and alcohol. You know why? Because the sense of belonging, the kids have a tremendous need to belong, and they have a sense of belonging to a family. See, a meal has always been much more than eating food. You know, I love it. You know, you got a wonderful pastor here. I really like Father Dan. He's a wonderful man. You got a nice priest here, and they have a family meal every night. And you know, it's just nice to sit around. I can go weeks on the road without a meal with someone. And I'll tell you something, I'm much more lonely at a place that doesn't have a family meal than when I go to a parish that has a family meal. It's much more satisfying. Now, I think that what I started to get to the point is, where I think that I mentioned on Sunday, Joan Ryan had in her column, a lot of parents don't want their kids to be involved in every activity because they're afraid if they don't, they'll lose their competitive edge. You know, I had a lot of kids told me last night in their things that they just feel overwhelmed with all these activities. You know, they just like to do things as a family. You know? So how much fear makes you control your kids? Again, I think that's where faith comes in, is you got to realize that you're not in control of your kids. You know, each one of them has a power. Suppose somebody were to tell you this. Suppose someone were to tell you that your kids had a power of love inside of them that was greater than themselves. That power of love was always inside of them. That there's nothing they could ever do so bad that love wouldn't forgive. There's nothing that can happen to them so tragically that love won't be there eventually to give them the strength to grow from it. Wouldn't you call that good news? Well, you know, my friends, that precisely is the good news of Jesus Christ. That your kids aren't alone out there, but that God's love is always there with them. You know, I'll bet you this thing about your life. I'll bet you that if you were to write your life story before you lived it, I doubt anyone would have ever put the cross in it. You never would have put the desert in it. And you know what? You never would have found God. And I'll bet you if you were to write your life story before your kids lived it, I doubt you'd ever put the cross in it. You never would have put the desert in it. And you know what? They'd never find God. You know, they're going to have to go through it. They're going to have to go through the desert. They're going to have to go through their crosses. That's how they learn in life. In fact, I think one of the worst way parenting is to take this pain away from your kids, because then when they get in there, Don talked about the suicides of his two dear friends. I think the problem with a lot of kids today, when they get into real frustration or turmoil, they have never developed a frustration tolerance. They don't know how to deal with frustration. They don't know how to deal with things when they go the other way, you know? Because the parents thought good parenting was taking that away, instead of teaching them to grow from it, to take responsibility, live the consequences, you know? So the second thing I'd like you to reflect on is how much fear is running your relationship with your kids. You know, how much does that motivate you? You know the problem with fear? The more you feed fear, the bigger the fear gets. The longer you keep the fear inside of you, the harder it is to get rid of. And you know what we do? If you have a lot of fear, you teach your kids to fear. It's just passed on, you know? So that's the second thing. So we want to talk about guilt, dealing with the human experience of guilt. We want to talk about fear. And the last one I want to talk about is anger. How much anger is in your family? You know, families have systems. All families have family systems. And some families have a lot of anger, and I think it's passed on from generation to generation. Let me show you something with anger. Now, let me take two forms of anger. Let me take guys' anger first. If you have a short fuse, if you can blow your top quickly, easily, you know what you've done, my friends? You have set things up that people are going to tell you what you want to hear rather than the truth. Because people are afraid of getting you angry. So they're going to people please. And so what I want to tell you is, if you have one of these quick fuses, that you really have that anger takes over. And that's how you get your kids' attention, is by getting angry at them or yelling at them. What you're doing is you're creating a situation where they're going to tell you what you want to hear because they don't want to get you angry. And you know, you can't have relationships with people if they don't tell you the truth. You know, I think we teach our kids a lot by how husband and wives relate to each other. Do they work things out positively, or do they yell and scream at each other? And I think even more common than my day, I say two things I'm really proud of about my parents. I've never once heard my mom gossip. I'm really proud of that. She ever says anything, she says something positive about somebody. And I've never heard my dad use a swear word, or talk negatively, or dirty jokes, or any of that stuff. Now I think that if you find out that you have a lot of anger, that's something that's got to be dealt with, because you're teaching your kids that's the way you deal with life, as you get angry. And you make it, or let's take the feminine type. That's the male type, is the blow is top. The feminine type is the passive aggressive. I'm not angry, I'm just hurt. Know what happens? And I'll tell you, it's very important for gals to know this. Did your moms become victims? Now, how a person becomes a victim is what happens is, instead of dealing with their anger and processing their anger, what happens is they use the word, I'm not angry, I'm just hurt. And so what happens, they make the other person the problem. Nothing wrong with me, I'm perfectly fine. I'll just wait for the other person to get their life together. Well, since I never get mad, because I'm not angry, I get even, passive aggressive. Those are the little comments, you know, the dig. Does anybody make humor, tell you jokes about you that make you angry? Because it's not really humor, it's humor with a barb. And what happens a lot of times, very common with women, if their moms become victims, in other words, they stay angry at their father and they never resolve it because they're not angry, they're just hurt. Then they teach their daughters the way you deal with anger is you become a victim. And the problem with victims is they think the problem is always somebody else. Now we're going to talk about the next 2 nights, and this is, we've done, I'll be glad to sign the books afterwards, and something that we've added, Don and I, to the book is a chapter on emotional honesty. And what that's saying is, whenever I'm angry, no matter how justified I am in my anger, anger is always my issue. I'm not going to feel better about life until I release the anger, no matter what the other person does. So what I'd like to talk about in the next 2 days is how to make anger positive in the family, so that we find some ways that we grow from it instead of all this unresolved anger. You know, the beautiful thing is, I told the kids last night, I used to tell people on their wedding day, you're not marrying each other, you're marrying each other's mother and father. Because what happens is, people bring all this anger from their childhood that's unresolved, and they bring it into their marriage. Unresolved anger stays there until you release it. And so what I like to talk about is how do we find a positive program in the family for both the kids and the parents to deal with anger in a positive way. Okay, you follow me? So what I really want to, what I see us doing, and we've gone kind of over the time now, a few more minutes, but what I'd like to do in the next 2 days is take the 3 emotions of guilt, fears, and angers and how to make them positive. You know something last night which I found, which would reinforce what Don said? It was hard to get the kids talking last night. You know, because we had 80, 85 kids, and they were all different ages. But I shared with them some of my fears when I was in high school. Some of the things that really scared me, and the fear, and they could identify, and they saw I was like them, and it helped them talk about their fears. But you know, it was so healthy for them to be able to talk about them. Because in a lot of ways, you release a lot of the stress when you can share it, you know, instead of keeping it as your secret. And I found the kids, they have a lot of fears that they're carrying around. And you know something? As I said the other night, how do kids hide their fears? Arrogance. But what a difference if you meet your kid, and your kid is going to be arrogant with you, which is going to probably get you angry. Or when your kid tells you the fears that they're going through, the pressures they're going through. then you can hear that and you can love them. Because they're telling you who they are. Do you follow me? And so it's a wonderful thing if kids can feel free to do that and you can respond to that. Now, that's more or less, I just wanted to set it up tonight, more or less what the approach is going to be the next 2 nights, to get you thinking about these 3 areas. I think if I can put an overview of what I'm going to talk about tonight, for both the kids and the parents. I think the time when a child, it begins in the 5th grade, the need to be cool, the need to become independent. Now, if a person doesn't become independent, they can't live their own life. And so the teenage years is a period in which a child is now learning about independence. And so that's where he moves away from his family. And it can be a very difficult time in a family because parents can be really hurt that my boy or my girl prefers to be with their friends to go out on a family picnic. You know, and it can hurt the feelings a lot. But if you can understand, it's a natural process. In other words, if the child doesn't break apart, he's never going to create that independence. So I think for parents to understand it and not take it personally, is see it as part of the journey of life, because, you know, I think it's important for parents to remember their own teenage years. You know, when I was thinking about my thoughts today and talking about it, I felt a little guilty because I was really close to, I had an Irish grandmother. And she was very special. I started when I was maybe 4th, 5th grade. I'd go and I'd cut her lawn and I'd pull her weeds, and she started a bank account for me. And she'd pay me, and I earned enough money to buy a car when I was in high school. And that was a privilege in 1957. Not everybody had a car. But when I thought about it today, I remembered that once I got the car, I forgot that Grandma was there, you know? And I remember I was thinking to myself how thoughtless I was all those years that I hardly ever called her, went over to see her, and yet she was such an important part of my life. But that's going to be a natural process for the kids moving towards their independence. But on the part of the kids, what I tell you would be really important, kids, to be sensitive to your parents and do some things maybe you don't feel like doing to show your support and your desire to be with the family. I remember how important it was for me when I was in high school to go fishing with my dad. He had a fishing boat. We used to go up the Napa River, go for a striped bass fishing. And how important that was to my dad that I still wanted to go fishing with him. And I think that was really important that I took the time for that. And so kids, what I'm telling you, you know, kind of the idea, the kind of way you measure it out is measured back to you. If you give a lot of love, you're going to get a lot of love. I think if parents, if they think about the point of realizing that the kids are on their own journey and they're not going to take it personally, could save a lot of hurt feelings. And if the kids on the other side, if they can think that now maybe, you know, I should be extra thoughtful to my parents because they need to know that I love them. Remember Jesus when he cured the 10 lepers? Remember how only one came back? And Jesus said, where are the other 9? You know why Jesus was upset? He needed to be appreciated. I just asked some of you kids, you know, with your parents. Some of your parents are super taxi cab drivers. They pick you up, they take you all over the place. Do you think you're entitled to it? Do they owe it to you? Or are you grateful? Can you say thank you? Can you show your appreciation? I remember I was giving a talk to kids one time and about being thoughtful to their parents, and one of the kids wrote me a letter back that, you know, he liked what I said. I said some challenging things. And so the next night, he got up and did the dishes without being asked. Then he sat his mom down and says, Mom, I know I don't often tell you this, but Mom, you're a great mom. You put a lot of love into being a mom, and I want you to know, Mom, I'm never going to forget you. You know what his mom's response was? What do you want? You know why? The only time the kids were nice to her is when they wanted something. So if I can tell you, kids, in the process of breaking apart and creating your own independence, it'll be really helpful in the family system if you can do some things, thoughtful things for your parents. Do things with them, you know, family picnics, family outings, just to show your love for them. You know, it's a great practice to do, sometimes to do, you know, I always say the difference between a good priest and a bad priest. A good priest is a priest who does a lot of things he doesn't want to do. And after he does them, he's so glad he did them. A bad priest is a guy who does just what he wants to do. And it can tend to make for selfish people. So I think, kids, to do things that you don't feel like doing, just out of love and thoughtfulness, is a wonderful thing, and you're always going to feel better afterwards. Okay, so that's my overview tonight. Now, I'd like to begin, when I talk about this, is something where if I could give you as a family something concrete to do. And no matter how young your kids are, some of you have young kids here, what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to spend a lot of energy learning how to listen. You know, I think it's one of the most difficult skills in the world is for a person to learn how to listen. See, listening is not the same thing as hearing. We're born to hear, but we have to learn to listen. Let me give you an example. Listening with an agenda means I have the answer before you start talking. So while you're talking, I'm not listening to a word you're saying, or I'm not listening to your feelings, because I'm thinking about what I'm going to say or what I want you to do. That's not listening, that's controlling. Listening without an agenda means I don't have the answer before you start talking. And while you're talking, I'm listening not only to your words, but your feelings behind the words. Because very often your feelings are much different than the words. And how do I know I'm listening? Because I don't know what I'm going to say until you finish talking. Do you all see the difference? Now, if I were to pass out a piece of paper to each one of you, and I were to ask you to draw a picture of your face, the ears the size of the amount of listening that you do, and your mouth the size of the amount of controlling that you do, what would your picture look like? How do you listen? In fact, when I talk to you, you are the most important person in the world to me, because you're the person I'm talking to. How do you feel when you're around somebody who, when they're listening to, make you feel really special? Doesn't that make you feel wonderful when you're the only person in the world to them? But when I'm listening to you, you are the only person in the world. You're the most important person in the world to me, because you're the person I'm talking to. How do you feel when you're talking to somebody whose mind is preoccupied? Or they're looking around the room to see who else they can talk to? Or their mind is a million miles away? Doesn't that make you feel lonely? Doesn't that make you feel lonely? When you're talking to somebody and they're not listening? In fact, you know, I think there's nothing that makes us angrier. Nothing that makes us angrier than when somebody doesn't listen to us. Isn't that what gets us angry? When somebody isn't listening to us. You're not listening to me. Now, I think, my friends, that we got to understand that there's a basic difference between listening and hearing. Hearing is a physical act. Listening is a spiritual act. That's why you can't listen to somebody and watch television. You can't listen to somebody and read the newspaper. Because listening is a sacred act. And you know, since I've started paying attention to this listening, I know some of my friends have daughters that are pretty young. Maybe the daughters are 6, 7 years old, 8 years old. And I watch sometimes, and the little child is talking away, and the father is not listening to a word she's saying. And you know what she starts doing? She starts babbling. She starts talking endlessly. You know, when people talk endlessly, you know what it is? It's a sign of loneliness. And so when the little girl, when their father isn't listening, the girl is just going to multiply words because she feels lonely, because she knows that dad isn't listening. Now, that's why I think, my friends, and I'm not just talking to the parents, I think this is really important for the kids too. to learn how to listen. And I'll tell you something, kids, if you learn how to listen when you're young, you've learned one of the greatest skills in the world to make relationships work. Let me give you a couple of reasons why I think this listening is so important. There is a big difference between acceptance and approval. Just think of those two words. I accept you and I approve you. Now those are two different concepts. To accept you is not the same thing to approve you. But you see, people that love conditionally, they make them the same thing. I'll love you when you're the way I want you to be, and I'll give you the silent treatment when you're not. That's making acceptance and approval. They're not the same thing. That's making them the same thing. But when I listen to you, that shows that I accept you. But when I'm listening to you, I may not hear things that I approve of while I'm listening to you, but it's in the context of you being accepted. Let me give you a good concrete example. When I was dean of discipline, and that was my job was to punish the kids. And I tried to never make it a set lecture or a set sermon when a kid came into my office. I wanted to find out what was going on in the kid's life before I ever said anything. Now, what I used to do, and you know, I dealt with the angry kids, the kids that were in trouble. And you know how hard sometimes to get them to open up. But I tried to ask good questions. I was patient with the kids. And I'll share some of the things tonight about discipline, because I was a disciplinarian. You know, it's something I'm really proud of. That when I was dean of discipline, year after year, they dedicated the yearbook to me as the most loved person on campus. Imagine that for the disciplinarian. And I'm proud of that. I really am proud of that, because a lot of what I'm going to share with you tonight, it really works with kids. And the kids basically trusted me. And what I do is when a kid came in my office, I tried to find out what was going on inside of the kid before I ever said anything. And sometimes, you know, it'd take a while, but I'd find out maybe the kid had been through a bloody divorce. Or the parents were going through a divorce at the time, and the kid was really angry. Or one or other, the parents had a drinking problem, or the kid had been verbally abused the night before. And it was my job to punish the kid. You know what I found, my friends? I found most kids' problems were either family problems, where I had to work with the family, or there were things like ADD or obsessive compulsive disorders, or kids had different problems that they had that caused the problems, you know. But I found out sometimes, you know, I had to throw the kids out of school. Sometimes I'd have to punish them severely. But the vast majority of kids respected what I had to say because I had taken the time to listen. And you know, many times what I'd have to do for the kid, instead of punishing the kid, I'd find maybe I'd have the kid take a walk and try to think some issues, and we're going to talk about it after school. So I'd sit down with the kid and talk about his feelings or some of the struggles in his life. So maybe sometimes I didn't punish the kid, because it wasn't something you punish a kid for. The kid was punishing himself enough, you know. But I found the kids respected what I had to say because I had taken the time to listen. And in listening to them, I showed that I accepted them. Now I think, my friends, I think today, with our fast-paced world, where everybody's running all the time, then it's sometimes really hard to take the time to listen. You know, I think we've got to find the time in our family. You know, one of the things that I think we really miss today is family days. You know, Sunday used to be family day when I was growing up. And it'd start with Sunday Mass. You know, the whole family going to Mass, and then Dad would cook a big breakfast. And we'd go have a picnic at Golden Gate Park, or we go visit relatives, or we go fishing. We do something as a family. And Sunday was just family day. And I remember times were different. We'd always go to Pete's Restaurant. There's a big Italian restaurant in San Francisco, in North Beach. in which we get, you get your big salad, you get your minestrone, your pasta, the antipasta, the chicken, and fritters, all for $3, But the beautiful thing was, I'll never forget that Sunday was always family day. And so there's a time when people can listen to each other, when people can hear what's going on. Even just a point, if I can just put a little parenthesis in here. Guys, those of you husbands, do you ever hear from your wives? Honey, you're not there for me emotionally. You don't give me the kind of emotional support I need in life. Do you ever hear that from your wives? You know what, oftentimes, and guys, those of you that when you start dating, this is a very important point to know. Oftentimes, all the woman wants from her husband is to listen to her without an agenda. That's all that the woman wants, is her husband to accept her. But you know what the guy is doing? While she's talking, he's thinking about how he can fix her. So then when he starts fixing her, they get in this big argument. She doesn't want to be fixed, she just wants to be listened to. Isn't that right, ladies? The tremendous ability to learn to listen. You know what I can say, and I'll say this between kids and parents. Just look at what's happening in your families now. Do you argue or do you discuss? First of all, husbands and wives. When you talk about money or do you talk about the kids, do you argue or do you discuss? When you talk to your teenagers, do you argue or do you discuss? Teenagers, when you talk to your parents, do you argue or do you discuss? There's a big difference between an argument and a discussion. An argument is that I may be right, that I may be in control. That's what an argument's about. A discussion is that the truth may be known. The truth may be known. So when listening, just like, I don't believe that the man is the head of the house. I think Paul was a male chauvinist. But so was every other male in Paul's time. In fact, when I performed weddings, I wouldn't let him read that reading. My dad's favorite reading, women be submissive to your husbands in all things possible. My dad just loved that reading. But you know what? I think what happens in a family is a husband listens to his wife without an agenda and gets her wisdom, and the wife listens to her husband without an agenda and gets his wisdom. And together they form the common wisdom of the family by listening to each other. I think, I found in my life, as I got older, that you never win an argument. And whenever I find that I'm in an argument, you know what I want to do is I want to get out of it as fast as possible. And you know how I get out of an argument really fast? I use something my mom taught me. She taught me by me watching her with my dad. You see, my dad always had to be right. He grew up in the Depression, and he ran the house with an iron fist. And he'd always have to be right. You know how my mom got out of the argument? She'd say to my dad, honey, you may be right. You may be right. You know what she was saying to him? You're darn wrong, but I don't want to talk about it anymore. Yeah. And so what I'm saying, my friends, if we learn to listen, we're not going to argue with each other. We're going to discuss with each other. We're going to listen to each other. We're going to learn from each other. And what I recommend is something I might have recommended when we had the mission here. I can't remember if I did or not. But all the families that are here tonight, because I think one of the most important spiritual things we can ever do is learn to listen. And believe me, kids, if you ever learn to listen, it's going to help every relationship you have in your life. See, for me, I didn't learn how to listen until I was in my 40s. I just presumed that listening was hearing. If you think listening is hearing, next time you're in an argument with your spouse or your kid, just ask them to repeat what you said. You may be amazed at how little they've heard. You know what I tell you to do? Get a big jar. Get a great big jar. And in the jar, what I'd like you to do is every time somebody in the family listens with an agenda, they have to put a quarter in the jar. Now, it doesn't take a genius to know when somebody's not listening. You're going to be talking to your dad, or you're going to be talking to your daughter, and you're going to know that her mind is a million miles away. And you're going to say, honey, you're not listening. He's going to go in his pocket, he's going to drop a quarter in the jar. Third time he's been to the bank this week. What you will do is you'll learn the language of listening. You'll learn to say to somebody, now don't think a thought, don't say a word until you've known what I've heard, until you've heard what I've said. I mean, just let me ask you kids, just so I can bring you into this discussion. Wouldn't it make you feel wonderful, kids, to know that whenever you asked your parents to do something, that they listened to you? That they heard what you had to say? They may not have agreed with you, but they heard you. Wouldn't that be wonderful? And parents, wouldn't it be wonderful? You see, what I see will happen when you start to listen is you're going to hear sometimes with your kids the fear that's behind the arrogance. And so you're going to react to the fear and not the arrogance. You're going to hear a lot, because you know, that, as I say, the kids are going through these tremendous pressures now of becoming independent. And they have a lot of peer pressure on them. And you know, for example, you take those old things, you know, I always thought to myself, well, how would I handle? I remember when years ago, it used to be the ponytail. And now it could be the earring or the tattoos. You know, how would I handle that, you know, as a parent? My kid wants a tattoo or wants to put an earring in their tongue, you know. I mean, how would I handle that, I ask myself, you know. But you know, a lot of times, what I have to understand as a parent, I got to understand the tremendous amount of peer pressure my kids are in, you know. That if certain things, that everybody's getting one, or everybody's getting one. If you don't get one, you're not cool, you know. I may not approve of it, and I may say no, but it makes a big difference if I can hear some of the fear that they have behind their demands. Are you following me? I think it's wonderful, because then the parents can react to the fear and be much more reassuring and helpful to the kid than react to the arrogance. And the same thing, kids. If you heard, for example, your parents' fear about some things, you know, maybe you want to stay out late, or you're going to a questionable party, and everybody's going to be there. Well, I mean, you don't know what's going to happen. And and what your kid wants to go. And you're really, you know, you're dead set against it. Well, if your kid can hear that behind your control is your love, that you're really afraid because you love your kids so much, you don't want your kids to get in trouble. You know, you're going to hear their love rather than their control. You're going to know that you may not agree with your parents' decision or how they're acting, but you know they love you. And they're acting out of love rather than control. Do you follow me? And that's what you can do when you start hearing what's beyond the words. And I'll tell you something, it's a much different relationship when you have a parent reacting to the fear and the kid reacting to the love versus arrogance meeting control. Now, I really recommend it, my friends, that you learn in your family to truly listen to each other. And so what I recommend is you get a big jar and you put it in your front room. Put it in your family room. And every time somebody listens with an agenda, they have to put a quarter in it. Now, I think it takes a long time to listen. So why don't you do it during the summer? Or even you can do it to Christmas. It might take a long time. And you know what happened? Your whole family can go to Europe for Christmas. Or you can help Father Frank feed South America, Central America. But just think you will have learned to listen. And I think the reason why I say make this little game out of it, because you can have some fun with it. I remember when I was in high school, in the 9th grade, I had an English teacher that every time we used the word because, we had to put a dime in the jar. He had a big jar in the front desk. And I'm probably the only person in Northern California or from San Francisco that ever uses the word, I say because. If you notice when I talk, I say because. I don't say because. Now, I learned to say because, whatever good that is. I don't know, it cost me a lot of money, but I learned it. I never found out where the money went either. But I really recommend that, my friends. I really recommend that you learn to listen. Husbands listening to wives, wives listening to husbands, children listening to their parents, parents listening to their kids. I think it will help you through many difficulties and many struggles. Now tonight, I want to talk a little bit as I go through this, just the general state of a kid. You got to remember now, parents and kids, you got to know this experience about yourself. When you start entering into this journey to become an independent person, you're going to feel a desire for power. That comes with independence. And oftentimes, my friends, that's why, for example, a kid is going to want to pick out their own clothes. They're going to choose how they look, because it's a sign of them becoming independent. Kids are going to have to express that control. Sometimes it'll come with being critical about their parents. But just remember now, they're experiencing this new power in their life, this new independence, and they're going to express it some ways. Now, it can be done in positive ways, where people develop independence. Sometimes it can become rebellion, which is unfortunate. What happens oftentimes, this new power can become rebellion if the parents are autocratic, or if the parents are way too controlling, way too demanding, way too strict. Then how are the kids going to deal with this new power? They're going to use it in rebellion. They're going to do things especially to upset their parents, because it becomes a battle of who's more powerful. So if you can understand that with your kids, that as they go through this experience of discovering their independence, if you can encourage it in self-esteem and realize its value to them, you know what's amazing? They used to do this in a lot of cultures. They have a lot of what we call primitive societies. They have these periods where kids are initiated, you know. They go through this experience of discovering their independence. I think it's some of these outward bound programs, you know, for kids, where they go out and they get in nature and they can learn to live on their own, you know, live off the land and stuff. I think some of those experiences are fantastic for teenagers, because it's a very positive way for them to develop their independence. So if you can do it in a positive way with your kids and be there with them, encouraging them instead of fighting them, you won't have that rebellion. Now, when I go on to this, do any of you have any specific questions about that? A specific case that I'm talking about? The gray area, when I'm talking about. I'm giving you a principle. There's always the gray area. When is it too much independence? You know, I think that's something that you have to negotiate with your kids. You know, when is a kid too independent? You know, maybe when it's becoming, but it's something that's natural. That's what I want to state, it's natural. Now, you got to also realize that the kids are going to protect their sense of self. They're going to really prize this new independence that they have. They're going to be jealous of it. They're going to guard it. So you're going to oftentimes, that's where the battle comes in, your will versus their independence. Now, I think, you know what I used to find with kids? I used to find when I worked with kids, if I could, first of all, what I did when I became Dean of Discipline, I got rid of any rule I couldn't explain. If we have rules just for the sake of rules, you know, you keep it because I told you so. What I did, if I couldn't explain to the kids where they made sense, then I got rid of it. I just didn't have them just for the sake of rules. Now, here's a principle that I used to find with kids that was very helpful. The more your kid has a sense of right and wrong, in other words, the more that your kid has a conscience, a sense of right and wrong, the more freedom you can give the kid. The more your kid doesn't have a sense of right and wrong, then the more you need the rules and regulations to protect them until they get a sense of right and wrong. I remember, they used to say, I didn't treat every kid the same way. I don't believe that you treat every kid the same way. I treated kids according to how much I could trust them. And I use the principle, it's very, very interesting with kids. And when I got the letters from the kids the other day, kids, a lot of you wrote down as the fact that how little your parents trust you. And that bothers you. When I became a dean of discipline, I followed a guy who he was a dictator. He used to make the kids write out the telephone book. He said it was a way for them to get to know new people. Well, you know what this guy did? He played cop, and the kids played robber. The kids were much worse for him than they were for me. Now, I found with the kids, and there are always exceptions, but I found with the kids, I trusted a kid until he gave me reason not to. My first attitude was to trust the kid, to give him that respect until the person gave me a reason not to. Instead of proving it to me, you got to earn my trust. And the amazing thing, I've always found that with people. People act the way people are going to respond the way you expect them to respond. If you expect the worst out of people, you're going to get the worst out of people. But if you expect the best out of them, you're going to get the best out of them. And so I think it's very, very important for a kid in what sense of conscience he had. And that means a kid has a sense of self. I remember I used to spend a lot of time with Dean of Discipline working with kids and trying to help them form a conscience. Because if a kid hasn't got a sense of right and wrong, how can they grow from anything? Because nothing's ever wrong, So your kid's conscience is very important. Now let me talk a little bit about how we develop a conscience. I think, let me just take when a kid gets in trouble, punishment. Now, see, a lot of our punishments are built on the prison system. We send people to their room, or they're going to campus them for the weekend. Now, when somebody does something wrong, they feel terrible about themselves. People do not feel good about themselves when they hurt their families. They have very low self-esteem. So notice how we punish people. What we do is we take away the things that are going to make them feel better about themselves. We take away their privileges. We let them stay in a room and stew about it. So probably the next thing they do will be twice as bad as the first thing they did. Let me share with you a thought that I think punishment is positive. I think the whole purpose of punishment is to give the person something positive to do to make up for the hurt that they've caused. It's a chance to make amends. I remember when I was dean of discipline, that's what I'd always do. When the kids got in trouble, I always tried to find a punishment that was equivalent to what they did wrong so they could do it, and so when they were doing it, they were doing something positive in their life to make them feel better about themselves, not worse about themselves. See, I don't think the whole purpose of punishment is negative. I think it's positive. It's to give a person a chance to do something positive to make up for the hurt that they've caused. So whenever a kid got in trouble, my whole purpose was, my first purpose with the kid was not to punish the kid. My first purpose with the kid was, how can this be a learning experience? How can this be a growing experience? insanity is filled with problems, but life is filled with problems, but insanity is when they're the same problems. So what we got to do is we got to find out how we get out of this vicious circle, you know, and we learn from it. But you see, when you focus everything on punishment, that's what the kid is going to learn, and he's not going to learn from the experience. So, and I think it's the same thing with dealing with God. Is the primary thing with God is God's forgiveness. And so when you're thinking with your kids, when your kids get into trouble, your first thought has to be, how can I help my kid grow from this? How can this be a learning experience? And you know something used to really bother me? I remember when I was dean of discipline, when a kid had got in trouble, and if everybody knew about it, if it was public, boy, the parents saw it completely different than if nobody knew about it, you know? It's like the whole thing about the appearance world was more important than what happened inside of the kid. You got to remember, the most important experience that your kids are going to have with you is when they're in messes. Are you there to lift them up, or are you there to beat them up? Are you going to make brokenness and the fact that we're human positive experiences or negative experiences? And so what I try to say, and I think that always the first attitude is, how can we grow from it? And then I think what has to happen is then what we need to do is we need to discuss, and I think that's something where parents and kids listen and talk to each other. What would be a suitable amends? What could you do now to make up for the hurt that you caused the family? Maybe there's a garage that needs cleaning. And just look at it psychologically. Now you got to remember, kids, I don't want to talk down on you on this, but a lot of times you don't share your feelings, you know, because you don't know them that much inside of you. So you're not going to ever tell your parents, hey, that was a great punishment. But you know, just think, suppose you really messed the family up. You got the family all upset. But here you are, cleaning the garage, sweeping it out, getting it ready. It looks really nice, you know, as all these boxes were there, you got rid of them. So when Dad comes home, there's a clean garage. Mom walks down, there's a clean, everybody sees this clean garage. You're going to feel good about yourself. You know, I did something good for my family. You may not say that to people, but those are going to be your feelings. You will have made amends. You will have done something positive to make up for how terrible you felt when you got into the mess. Do you all follow me? So I really believe the whole purpose of punishment is positive. It's not a negative thing. See, a negative thing is our prison system. And that's what I mean. When we campus them, put them in their rooms for the weekend, or they can't go out, we take away their privileges. We take away the things that are going to make them feel good about themselves. I think what I'm sharing with you is a punishment system built on the gospel, on God's unconditional love, rather than built on the prison system. Do I have any questions on that? I mean, anybody have any questions on that? Does it make sense to you? Yes?
If a teenager breaks curfew, comes home an hour late, do you discuss it when they come home, when you're half asleep and you're upset and they're, you know, reacting? Or do you say, we'll talk about it in the morning?
Well, you know, I'm going to talk when we get to anger. I never strike while the iron's hot.
Let them think about it.
No, I used to tell the kids, sometimes I get so mad at the kids when I was dean of discipline, I'd tell them, don't let me find you. Hide from me for a day. Let me some time to think about it and pray over it and see how we can make it positive. Because if I do it when I'm angry, I'm always going to be negative. Let me just give you an example of that, listening, for example. Suppose your kid came home an hour late. You know, you don't know everything that's going on. You know, you can presume the worst. But maybe there's some pressures on them. Maybe the thing is, you know, it would be much better if you listened to the kid and had the kid tell you why he came home late or why she came home late. You know, and you really listen, and maybe there was a reason, you know. A question? Yes?
Say that your parents touch you too much.
I can't hear you, honey.
Say the parents touch you a lot. What if that makes the kids lie more about their, like, if your mom says go to the movies, but don't hang out with, like, guys or something, and
That's a good question, honey. What you're saying is, if I can paraphrase it, suppose my parents said I can go to the movie, but I can't go with the guys. Is that right? But you end up going with the guys. Huh? Now, let me show you the dynamics in something like this. First of all, I don't know how much there's a pressure on you to peer pressure, what kind of a relationship. I'll put it this principle as a parent. Do I want to know what's going on inside of my kid, or do I not want to know? You know, a lot of parents don't want to know what's going on. They don't tell me, you know. They'd rather not know. I'd rather have a relationship with you to find out where you are right now in terms of your relationship with guys, what kind of kids these are, where you can be honest with me if we can work it out. I'd much rather have that kind of a dialogue and find out what's going on. I don't like to develop where kids have to lie to me. Because once the thing is, once you tell that first lie, it's always much easier to lie, you know? And so my problem is, if I'm your father and you're lying to me, we can't have a relationship if I never know whether you're telling me the truth or not, you know? And I'd rather if I would spend some time in that, I don't know what grade you're in, I'd like to find out what all the circumstances are in it, and I try to help you. Maybe you have a lot of peer pressure, maybe all of your friends are doing that, you know what I mean? I'd rather communicate and find out what's going on inside of you rather than you sneaking behind my back. If I can put you in a situation where you don't have to lie to me, I'd much prefer that than working it out in communication. Yes, sir.
I think the first question was, doesn't punishment or discipline foster lying if the punishment is severe?
Especially if it's not balanced. Yeah. I think it does. That's why I think the thing is why perfectionists, if I'm raised by perfectionist parents, that whenever I make a mess, I'm going to be punished. What I learn to do is tell them what they want me to hear, what they want to hear. Now, I think that happens. I think we create children that lie to us. But let me talk a little bit about consequences, because I think this is one of the most important things as I'm talking about human experiences and messes and the things that we get into. I think one of the most important things that we teach our kids is all actions have consequences. If you make a good decision, expect good consequences. If you make a bad decision, expect bad consequences. I think that's very important. I think it's a terrible job of parenting when people absorb the consequences for their kids. I think life is filled with consequences. And I know so many people, seeing so many weddings and divorces today. I've known so many people that on their wedding day they thought that they were going to change their spouse after they got married. That's a bad decision. And that usually has bad consequences. So if you realize that whenever you make a bad decision, you not only get the decision, but you get the consequences to that. Now, I think that's what I'd like to talk a little bit about consequences, teaching our kids consequences. I think, for example, you're talking about kids going out, curfew, for example. I think it's good to discuss this with the kids where you both listen. And then I think what you do before any of the actions ever happen, you discuss what are the consequences if the boundaries aren't maintained. And I think you do with the kids. But the thing about consequences is they have to be fair. If, for example, if you come home late for dinner one night and that means you're not going to go out on the weekend, that's not a good consequence. That's not a fair consequence. Maybe if you come home late one night, you're going to get a cold dinner. That's the consequences. So I think it's very important that the consequence fits the action. And that's why I think it's important to discuss what certain actions have consequences. But I think that's very important, just like with teenagers. I don't think you can form them like they're little kids anymore. You don't have that kind of power over them anymore. They're going out and they're discovering their own independence. But what you do create with teenagers is actions have consequences. And so what you try to do is give them consequences that are commensurate to what if they don't keep the rules. So they realize when they make the decision, expect the consequences. I'll get to it in a minute. But let me say two things about consequences. Never say anything to your kid unless you're going to follow through. You know, if you say things to your kids and you don't follow through, your kids are going to quit listening. You know, I remember when teachers would say things to the kids, if you do this, this is going to happen, and they didn't do it, and the kids quit listening. It's like when my mom was a great disciplinarian without being a disciplinarian. We used to come to church, we were quiet during church on Sunday, you know, we'd have pretty civil meals, we'd go to bed when we were supposed to go to bed. Because whenever my mom said something, she followed through. And so we always listened to what she had to say. My dad was just the opposite. We knew if we worked hard enough on my dad, we could get him to change his mind. So whenever my dad said something, our first reaction was, how are we going to get him to change his mind, you know? So never say anything with your kids unless you're going to follow through with it. That these are the consequences. And here's the second thing. Never take it personally. Your kid is not doing it to you personally. Because when you take it personally, that's conditional love. And your kid is going to react to you taking it personally, and they'll never learn the consequences. You know, that's what real hard love is. Hard love is, I love you so much, kids, I want you to learn that life has consequences. In other words, the consequences come from love. They don't come from anger. They come from love. Because life is filled with consequences. And so the big thing, my friends, is if you take it personally, what you've done is you've messed up the issue. Because the kid will always react to you taking it personally. That's the trouble with the silent treatment. And you know, to be very honest with you, you know where the silent treatments come from and all the guilt games and all that stuff comes from? It comes from insecurity. And what happens a lot of times is parents will use their kids to fill up the hole inside of them. They're finding their meaning in their kids. And so when the kids don't give them their meaning, they got to punish them. So that's where an awful lot of the taking it personally and all that kind of stuff. To see, the more confident you are in yourself and your own personhood, the less personally, they're not doing it to you. They're going through their growing experiences. You know? So that's a big, big thing. Once you take it personally, the kid owns you. You know? The kid won. You know? Well, actually didn't win, but you lost. We'll put it that way. So you got to, yes, a young man there had a hand up.
What happens when you're, like, for some reason you're not able to do anything, and your parents don't believe you, and you tell them the truth, and for whatever reason you weren't able to do it, and it comes to anyway, what do you do?
You're telling me that what happens when your parents, when you're telling them the truth, but they don't believe you? Is that what you're saying then? Punish you for when you're telling them the truth. Well, you know, on some things I would put on, it depends upon whether this is a normal pattern or this is just a happenstance. It's just something that rarely happens or something that commonly happens. Those are two different things. What I would do if I were in that situation, advice, is I'd wait a few days, things calm down, and maybe have a talk with both your mom and your dad individually and talk about the thing. But you know what I would? Instead of talking about their behavior, that they didn't trust you, what I talk about is how hurt you felt, that you were trying to be honest with them and they didn't trust you, and you really don't want to have a relationship with them where they don't trust you. So you're talking about how you feel rejected rather than their behavior. Do you follow what I'm saying? That's how I try to handle it. And hopefully your parents would listen to you. You know? Sometimes, you know, the problem is parents can be too afraid and their fear can get in the way, and their fear gets in the way of trusting. You know? And again, what is your track record too? That makes a difference too. Another question? Yes?
Are there situations where this behavior is personal, where they're trying to get your
Like, for example, let me take a few of those situations. Huh? What's your first name? Lisa asked the question, what happens when it has turned personal? That the kid is, for example, it's revenge, or they're passive aggressive or something like that. They're getting even. I'd say two things to look at. First of all, is it come from me being autocratic? You know what I mean? Am I creating a situation where say for example, a kid wants his independence. That's what this whole teenage stuff is about. But suppose I'm squashing every bit of independence he has. And so what happens, his attitude is maybe they can get even. I've known kids, I had an amazing, when I taught English, some of the kids that did the worst in English were parents who were English teachers. You know? So I'm not going to get mad, I'm going to get even. I can't tell you how many policemen I know whose children were wild, you know? That what happens if you're going to be too autocratic, I'm going to get even. I'm going to make you pay the price. I don't ever think confrontational things work on that way. I think what you've got to realize is a kid that acts like that is really in negative energy. You know, they're really living a lot of negative energy, and they have probably terribly low self-esteem. I'd use it to see how I could work with the kid and find out maybe how we could develop a better relationship rather than attack. You know what I mean? I think the behavior itself is so bad that I think that what would happen is that if you attacked it, you'd only make it worse, and they want to get even more, you know? So I think it would be a time for real reflection and to look at the situation. Do you follow what I'm saying? Sometimes you need to get some outside help. You really do. When it's a continual pattern that the kid is maybe so low self-esteem or so much anger inside. I want to take anger, probably tomorrow night, as I take anger in the family. I just wanted to deal with the whole thing and discipline and consequences tonight, but I do want to deal with that anger thing and how to deal with it. But sometimes if something is continual and there's no way of seeming to correct it, I think sometimes you just got to ask for outside help. Yes. Well, what's your name, honey? Mary? You know what Mary asked the question is, and I think it's right on, is your question is, when parents yell and scream at their kids and punish them, isn't that going to mean that the kids are going to do worse things? Let me just use a basic principle, is the better self-esteem a person has, the more a person likes themselves, the more likable things they're going to do. The more a person hates themselves, the more a person doesn't like themselves, the worse things they're going to do. We're always going to reveal what's inside of us, you know? And so if what happens is, if we find out that in our family system that we're constantly beat on and made to feel like we're worth less, we're going to act like we're worth less. Yeah, I do think that. That's why I see punishment, as I mentioned before, as something positive to help build up a person's self-esteem rather than tear a person down. That's why I think it's so important. Because I think, you know, Mark Twain said about the teenage years, kids are expected to be adults and treated like children. And I think there's some truth to that. It's a very difficult time for a person because they got all this peer pressure, all this family pressure, and somehow they've got to build some self-esteem in the midst of it all, you know? And I think the more you can be conscious of the kids' struggle with that and help them through it, because we're supposed to be the adults, you know? And I think one thing I'd also make a statement on this too. I think it's really important for parents, don't worry whether your kids like you or not. You know, if you worry about whether your kids like you or not, you've established them as king and queen of the house. You know, my parents could care less whether we liked them or not. Some days we did and some days we didn't. Because if you do that, you know, and I'd like some feedback on this one. I don't know if I'm an old prude on this, but this happened over in Marin County. I have a relative over there. And when the kids graduate from high school, they go down to Mexico for a week, 10 days, and the Mexico, down there they supply the chaperones, mixed group of boys and girls together. I have a real hard time with that. You know, I mean, I have a hard time with that because I think that what you're doing is, what are you going to do for 10 days? Booze, drugs, and sex, you know? And I don't think you make it easier. I think there needs to be some boundaries in that. But don't know where parents' heads are at, you know? I have real hard times with those kind of things because I think the problem is that the parents want their kids to like them, you know. And so what you want to be buddies, and so you make decisions based on them liking you rather than what's good for the kid. Do I have any other questions on this, on discipline? No questions. Does it make sense to you? Now, let me take, well, listen, it's pretty much the hour already. Yes, sir. I can't, you're going to have to talk a little louder. Would be losing a privilege? Regaining a privilege. You know, see, my problem with privileges and taking away privileges and stuff is, say that these things make a kid feel better about himself. I'd rather go the way I told you before of giving positive punishments. You know, find things that need to be done around the house or something like that, rather than taking something away. I would go more in the positive direction. That seems to be a little bit more negative punishment. That makes sense to you? I'd rather do, see, what you got to understand is when the kid gets into a mess, when the kids screw up, the kid feels worse. See, we hate to hurt people we love. Now, the kids aren't going to share that with you. You know, God, I feel so terrible because I hurt you, Mom or Dad. They don't share that with you because they don't share their feelings with you. But they don't feel good. People do not enjoy hurting the people they love. And so what we want to do is through the process of growing from it is to restore the self-esteem that they lost. And it seems to me like this would encourage kids to be honest with their parents instead of lying. You know, the positive things would happen in the family. And I'll tell you something, when I was dean of discipline and I'll tell you, the kids were so much better for me than they were for the guy that I followed. The kids were just, I mean, it was wonderful, the kind of relationship I had with the kids and the kind of school they created, and it brought the best out of them. You know, and I think that's what we got to do, bring the best out of our kids. And just realize, you know, all of your kids are going to get into messes. That's part of being human. But the big thing about the messes is they got to learn from them, grow from them. They got to be growing experiences for them. You know, I think that's the key thing for it. So our first attitude with our kids is not to punish them. The first attitude is how can we help our kids grow from it? So our first thing is love, you know. And I think but again, if I can go back to, if you haven't, you might get the week one of the tapes, or if you have week one of the tapes from last time I was here. You see, my friends, the secret is this. All of our relationships are mirrors of our relationship with ourselves and our God. You see, if you have a personal God in your life, the good news of Jesus Christ, that you know that God is there to lift you up, to help you grow from it, then you're going to give that gift away from your kids, to your kids. You know the most important thing when you get into a mess is to grow from it. But when you get into a mess, the first thing you do is beat yourself up. I remember how I used to be. You know, I'm not a person that swears very much, but when I used to get mad at myself, I'd use swear words I never used to anybody else. You know? I just beat myself up all the time. And that's what I did to other people. I beat them. I remember, you know, it was so wonderful when I've changed this in my life. I remember when I used to be, somebody had let me down and I walked by them and pretend like they didn't exist so they'd really feel guilty, you know. I'm going to make them feel even worse, you know. Because I did that to myself. And so I think an awful lot of this, my friends, that's why I think the most important reality in our lives is the gospel. I think when we truly believe that God loves us without any conditions, God loves us just the way we are, I think that gives us the freedom to be ourselves, and then we can give that gift away to our loved ones, you know? And so, I mean, I think if we have it, but you know, I can talk to you until I'm blue in the face, but if you don't first do it to yourself, you're never going to do it to your kids. You know? So the most important thing is to let God love you first. And then you're going to give it away. You know, Christianity, make no mistake about it, Christianity is a spirituality of inner transformation. If we really believe that God loves us, it has to affect how we live our lives. It has to change our lives. And we're going to give away what God has given us.